On July 17, 2015, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a call came into the Los Angeles Police Department about an abandoned SUV parked on a quiet residential street in Pacific Palisades, California. Inside the vehicle was a body, badly decomposed, no identification on the scene, no obvious signs of foul play, just a man, alone, in a parked car, as if he had simply stopped and never started again. The body was transported to the coroner's office for identification, and that is where things stopped making sense. The coroner could not find fingerprints, not damaged fingerprints, not partial fingerprints, no fingerprints at all. This matters more than it might seem, because fingerprints are among the last tissues the human body loses in decomposition. They outlast nearly everything else, and yet on this man, they were simply gone, as if they had never been there to begin with. Dozens of militarized vehicles, and $230,000 in cash. None of it registered. None of it explained. A private arsenal large enough to supply a small army, belonging to a man almost no one had ever heard of. Who was Jeffrey Allen Lash? Where did the weapons come from, and why, after everything investigators uncovered, did so many details of his life remain buried, unanswered, faded into the silence that tends to surround cases like this one? Those questions have never been fully resolved. But here is what makes this story more than just a strange footnote in a Los Angeles police report. Within the research community that studies contact between humans and non-human intelligences, Lash's case carries an additional layer. There are those who suggest his father may have been connected to the 1947 Roswell incident, brought in as a scientist to study materials recovered from the crash site. If that is true, then what Jeffrey Allen Lash represented may not have been the beginning of something. It may have been the continuation of something ancient, something that has been quietly unfolding across centuries, written into the oldest texts our civilization has ever produced, and perhaps written into something far more personal than that, written into us. Before we go any further, I want to take just a moment to welcome you here. I am Mr. H, and this is the Mr. H Chronicles, a place where we follow the threads that history left behind, the ones most people walk past without noticing. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss what we uncover next. For those of you who have been here before, welcome back. It genuinely means a great deal. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because the story of Jeffrey Allen Lash does not start in 2015. It does not start in 1947. It starts thousands of years ago, in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, in texts carved into clay long before anyone alive today was born, in a question that human beings have been whispering to themselves across every culture, every language, every era of recorded history. What if we were never entirely alone in our own origin? What if something else was there, at the very moment we became what we are? And what if some of what was left behind is still here? There is a number that has quietly unsettled the scientific community for well over a decade now. Not a theory, not a speculation, a number produced by one of the most rigorous fields of modern science that does not fit neatly into the story we have been telling ourselves about where we came from and how we got here. That number is 7, as in 7%. In the early 2000s, Dr. John Hawkes, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Wisconsin, completed one of the most comprehensive analyses of human DNA ever undertaken at that time. He and his team were looking at genetic material spanning thousands of years, comparing the genome of people who lived around 3000 BC against the genome of people alive today. What they found was not a gradual, steady drift of the kind you would expect from normal evolutionary pressure over time. What they found was acceleration. Dramatic, almost inexplicable acceleration. Human DNA had changed by 7% in roughly 5,000 years. To understand why that number matters, you have to hold it against everything that came before it. For hundreds of thousands of years, human genetics moved slowly. The way a river moves through flat land, small changes, incremental shifts, the kind of quiet biological patience that evolution is famous for. And then, right around 3000 BC, something changed the current entirely. The rate of genetic change in our species became approximately 100 times faster than any comparable 5,000-year window in the entire history of human existence on this planet, 100 times faster. Dr. Hawkes himself described it as a period of extraordinarily rapid evolution. In his own published research, he noted that humans today are, in measurable genetic terms, more different from people who lived 10,000 years ago than those people were from Neanderthals. That is not a casual observation. That is a statement that should have permanently altered the conversation about human origins. And in some academic circles, it did. But for most of the world, it passed quietly, buried beneath the noise of daily life, largely undiscussed. What happened around 3000 BC? That question has an almost uncomfortable set of answers when you line them up together, because 3000 BC is also, not coincidentally, the period during which the first true civilizations appeared on Earth, with what historians describe as startling speed. Sumer in Mesopotamia, the early dynastic period of ancient Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley civilization in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. These were not slow-building cultures that crept gradually toward complexity over millennia. They arrived, as the archaeological record shows, with remarkable suddenness. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, irrigation, architecture, legal codes, all of it emerging, as if from almost nowhere, within a relatively narrow band of human history. What remains unexplained is why the genetic acceleration and the civilizational acceleration appear to be happening at the same time. Now, in 2010, in Leipzig, Germany, a discovery was announced that added an entirely new dimension to this question. Svante Pääbo, a geneticist working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, made a finding that rewrote the textbook understanding of human prehistory. His team had been analyzing ancient DNA extracted from fossil remains, and what they confirmed was that early modern humans had not evolved in clean isolation. They had interbred with Neanderthals, with another group called the Denisovans, known to us only through a fragment of bone, a single finger bone, recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia in 2008. And beyond those two groups, Pääbo's research pointed toward the genetic signature of at least one additional population, a group that has not been identified, a group that left its mark on human DNA without leaving behind, as far as we have yet discovered, a single fossil, a single tool, a single recoverable trace of physical existence. Researchers have taken to calling them the ghost population. One theory suggests that this unidentified contributor to the human genome was simply another branch of the ancient hominid family tree, one that has not yet been located in the fossil record. That is the most straightforward explanation, and it may well be the correct one. Science moves carefully, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The ghost population may one day have a name, a face, a set of bones resting somewhere beneath the soil waiting to be found. But what remains unexplained is the nature of the genetic material they contributed. Pääbo's team and subsequent researchers found that certain sequences introduced into the human genome from this unidentified source appear in regions associated with immune function, neurological development, and cognitive complexity. In other words, whatever this population was, the parts of themselves they passed on to us were not random. They were, in the language of genetics, highly functional, highly specific, the kind of sequences that, if you were designing a more capable organism, you might choose to introduce deliberately. Archaeologists have noted that this pattern of sudden complexity, appearing simultaneously in genetics, in culture, in architecture, and in recorded mythology across multiple unconnected civilizations, is one of the genuinely open problems in the study of human origins. Not a fringe concern, an open problem discussed in peer-reviewed literature, sitting without a satisfying resolution. And then there is what the ancient Sumerians wrote down. The cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, among the oldest written records on the planet, describe beings called the Anunnaki. The word itself translates roughly as those who came from the heavens to earth. These beings, according to the texts, were involved in the creation or the modification of human beings. The tablets describe a deliberate process, a purpose. For a long time, these stories were read as mythology, as allegory, as the ancient mind reaching for metaphor to explain what it did not understand. And that may be exactly what they are. One theory suggests, however, that when the oldest literate civilization in human history writes down, in careful and specific language, that beings from elsewhere altered the nature of humanity, and when modern genetic science simultaneously finds evidence of an unidentified population that contributed precise, functionally significant sequences to human DNA right around the time those civilizations appeared, the overlap is at minimum worth sitting with, not as proof, not as conclusion, but as a question that deserves more than silence. 7%, 100 times faster than anything before it. A ghost population that left no bones. A finger bone from a Siberian cave that rewrote the map of human prehistory. And a set of ancient texts, written by people who had no reason to fabricate them, describing something arriving from beyond this world and reaching into the biology of human beings. The science does not tell us what caused the acceleration. It only tells us that the acceleration happened, and that whatever caused it, it changed us in ways we are still only beginning to measure. Which brings us to the oldest stories humanity has ever told. Because long before there were laboratories, long before there were geneticists and sequencing machines and peer-reviewed journals, people were writing something down, carving it into stone, pressing it into clay, painting it onto the walls of temples that have stood for centuries beyond counting. They were writing about the moment something came from the sky. Nearly every major civilization on Earth. The names change. The locations change. The languages are separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. But the core of the story remains the same, with a consistency that is difficult to explain away as coincidence. Beings from elsewhere came to this world. They interacted with human beings, and in many accounts, across many cultures, they did not simply observe. Intimately, biologically involved. And the offspring of those unions became something that did not fit cleanly into either category. Not fully human, not fully whatever the other thing was. Something in between. This is not a modern idea. It is not the product of late-night radio programs or internet forums. It is written in the oldest documents our civilization has ever produced. Let us begin where writing itself began. The city of Ur, located in what is now southern Iraq, near the modern town of Tel el-Mukaya, was one of the great centers of Sumerian civilization. By approximately 3000 BC, the people of Sumer had developed one of the earliest known writing systems on Earth, pressing symbols into wet clay with reed styluses, creating tablets that would harden and survive for millennia beneath the soil of Mesopotamia. Among the texts they left behind are accounts of beings called the Anunnaki, a word that the Sumerian language renders as something close to those who from heaven to earth came. The Enuma Elish, among the oldest cosmological texts ever recovered, describes these beings in terms that are neither symbolic nor vague. They are presented as physical entities, with intentions, with hierarchies, with disagreements among themselves about what to do with humanity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, portions of which predate the biblical flood narrative by over 1,000 years, describes a world in which the boundary between the divine and the human was not fixed. It was permeable. It was crossed. Archaeologists have noted that the Sumerian texts are unusual among ancient mythological traditions in their specificity. They do not simply describe gods in abstract, poetic terms. They describe logistics. They describe locations. They describe procedures. The language used in the Anunnaki accounts is, as several scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature have observed, much closer to the language of historical record than to the language of allegory. One theory suggests that this specificity is precisely what makes the Sumerian texts worth re-examining through a different lens, not as religious literature, but as reported experience, filtered through the understanding and vocabulary available to the people doing the recording. Now move westward and forward in time by only a few centuries. The text known as Genesis, forming part of the Hebrew Scriptures, contains a passage that has generated more theological and academic controversy than almost any other section of that ancient document. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. It reads, in the most direct translation available, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful and took them as wives, and the children born of those unions became the Nephilim, beings described as mighty, as famous, as belonging to a category distinct from ordinary humanity. The Hebrew word Nephilim is itself deeply contested. Some translate it as fallen ones. Some render it as giants. Some scholars of ancient Hebrew argue that the word carries a meaning closer to those who were cast down, implying an origin point somewhere other than Earth. What remains unexplained is why this passage, which appears in one of the most carefully preserved and analyzed texts in human history, has never received a fully satisfying conventional explanation. The sons of God is a phrase that, in its original linguistic context, does not straightforwardly mean human beings, and yet the idea that it might mean something else has remained, for the most part, a conversation held at the edges of mainstream biblical scholarship rather than at its center. But the Hebrew scriptures are not the only place this story was preserved. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ad-Dib was searching for a lost goat near the cliffs of Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in what was then British Mandatory Palestine. He threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound of pottery breaking. What he had found would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Among those documents was the Book of Enoch, a text that had been largely excluded from the canonical biblical tradition, but had been preserved intact for centuries in the dry silence of the Judean desert. The Book of Enoch describes, in considerable detail, a group of beings called the Watchers. 200 of them, according to the text, descended to a mountain referred to as Mount Hermon, located in the region where modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel meet. There, they made a collective decision to take human women as companions. The offspring of those unions are described in the text as beings of enormous size and appetite, who disrupted the natural order of the world so profoundly that it contributed to the catastrophe described elsewhere as the Great Flood. The Watchers themselves, according to Enoch, were punished for what they had done, bound, imprisoned, cast into darkness until a final judgment. Archaeologists have noted that the Book of Enoch predates many of the canonical texts it appears to have influenced, and that its level of narrative detail, including specific numbers, specific locations, and specific consequences, places it in the same category of specificity observed in the Sumerian records. Now travel east, thousands of miles east, to the Indian subcontinent, where the Mahabharata, one of the longest epic narratives ever composed, describes a world in which the boundary between the human and the divine was, again, not fixed. The Devas, beings associated with the sky and with powers beyond ordinary human capacity, are described throughout the text as interacting with human women and producing offspring who carried qualities of both. These children, the Deva Manusha, occupied a position in the ancient Indian understanding of the world that closely mirrors the Nephilim of the Hebrew tradition and the offspring of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian accounts. Beings caught between categories, beings who did not belong entirely to either world. The same pattern appears in ancient Greece, where the offspring of gods and humans, figures like Heracles, Achilles, and Perseus, were understood as literal biological hybrids, not metaphors for human aspiration, but actual physical beings who inherited specific traits from a non-human parent. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was understood to be the literal son of a divine being, a concept that was not merely ceremonial, but was treated as a biological and legal fact that carried specific consequences for governance and succession. In the oral traditions of indigenous cultures across the Pacific, across sub-Saharan Africa, across pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the same story echoes. Something came from the sky, something interacted with human beings. Something was left behind. One theory suggests that these accounts, separated by ocean and desert and language and millennium, are not describing the same mythology. They are describing the same event, recorded independently by people who had no contact with one another, each preserving a fragment of something that actually occurred. What remains unexplained is how stories this specific, this consistent, and this geographically widespread could have emerged separately from pure imagination. The history of human mythology contains countless regional variations, countless locally invented gods and spirits, and supernatural beings that appear in one culture and nowhere else. But the story of sky beings descending, interacting with human women, and producing hybrid offspring is not regional. It is not local. It appears everywhere. In the oldest texts, in the most ancient oral traditions, carved into stone in languages that could not have borrowed from one another. The ancient world was trying to tell us something. Whether we are willing to hear it depends, perhaps, on how willing we are to take seriously the possibility that the people who carved these accounts into clay and stone were not inventing stories to explain what they did not understand. They were recording what they had witnessed, or what their ancestors had witnessed, as carefully and as honestly as the tools available to them allowed. And if that is true, then the genetic anomalies Dr. Hawkes and Svante Pääbo identified in the modern human genome are not an isolated scientific curiosity. They are a biological echo of something the ancient world already knew. Something intervened. Something changed the human story. And the oldest voices we have, from every corner of this ancient and silent planet, have been telling us that for a very long time. The ancient world was trying to tell us something. Whether we are willing to hear it depends, perhaps, on how willing we are to take seriously the possibility that the people who carved these accounts into clay and stone were not inventing stories to explain what they did not understand. They were recording what they had witnessed, or what their ancestors had witnessed, as carefully and as honestly as the tools available to them allowed. And if that is true, then the genetic anomalies Dr. Hawkes and Svante Pääbo identified in the modern human genome are not an isolated scientific curiosity. They are a biological echo of something the ancient world already knew. Something intervened. Something changed the human story. And the oldest voices we have, from every corner of this ancient and silent planet, have been telling us that for a very long time. I want to pause here for just a moment, because this is the part of the journey where I always find myself curious about who is traveling it alongside me. Right now, as you are sitting with all of this, as these stories from Sumer and Qumran and the banks of the Ganges settle into wherever it is that ideas settle when they are too large for easy answers, where in the world are you? What city, what country, what quiet corner of this planet are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? There is something I find genuinely moving about the fact that people separated by oceans and time zones are sitting with the same ancient questions at the same moment. It reminds me that these questions were never really local. They never belonged to any one culture or any one era. They belong to all of us. Now, if the written record preserved across 5 continents points towards something that came from beyond this world and left its mark on human biology, then the next question is not a historical one. It is a contemporary one, because there are people alive today who do not describe these encounters in the past tense. It's at the very edge of what most people are willing to consider seriously. Not because the people who report it seem unstable or unreliable. In many cases, they are precisely the opposite. Educated, grounded, with no history of psychological disturbance and no apparent motivation to fabricate something that would, in most social contexts, make their lives considerably more difficult. The experience is this: a person is taken, not metaphorically, not in a dream, or at least not in any dream they can distinguish from waking reality. They are physically removed from their environment, brought somewhere they do not recognize, subjected to procedures they did not consent to, and returned, sometimes hours later, sometimes with physical evidence on their bodies that was not there before, almost always with a period of missing time they cannot account for and cannot recover through ordinary means. This experience has been reported across every decade since at least the middle of the 20th century. It has been reported by people in the United States, in Brazil, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Russia, in Japan. It has been reported by farmers and by academics, by children and by retired military personnel, by people who had never heard of the phenomenon before it happened to them, and by people who had spent years dismissing it as nonsense. And in a significant number of these cases, the procedures reported are not random. They follow a pattern that, when examined across hundreds of independent accounts collected by serious researchers over several decades, points towards something that is difficult to categorize as anything other than a deliberate biological program. We begin in New Hampshire. September 19th, 1961. Betty and Barney Hill were driving south along US Route 3, returning from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. It was late. The road was largely empty. Somewhere in the White Mountains, south of the town of Lancaster, they noticed a light in the sky that did not behave like any aircraft either of them had seen before. It moved against the wind, it changed direction without the arc that conventional aircraft require, and then it descended toward their car with a speed and directness that caused Barney to stop the vehicle on the roadside and step out to observe it through binoculars. What he saw through those binoculars, he would later describe with a consistency that never wavered across years of subsequent interviews. Figures, standing at the windows of a craft that hovered no more than a few hundred feet above him, figures that were looking back at him. The Hills drove. They arrived home in Portsmouth approximately 2 hours later than they should have, with no memory of the intervening time. Their watches had stopped. The leather strap of Barney's binoculars was inexplicably torn. Betty's dress had been damaged in ways she could not explain. Around the trunk of their car were a series of circular, magnetized patches that caused a compass needle to spin when held near them. In the months that followed, both Betty and Barney experienced severe anxiety, recurring nightmares, and a persistent sense of something unresolved that neither of them could name. They were eventually referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a Boston-based psychiatrist and neurologist with a distinguished professional record and a reputation for rigorous, skeptical clinical practice. Simon was not a believer in extraterrestrial phenomena. He approached the case as a medical professional approaching a psychological problem. What emerged from the sessions he conducted with Betty and Barney Hill, separately, under hypnotic regression, was not what he expected. The accounts that surfaced were detailed, internally consistent, Simon himself acknowledged, were difficult to explain through ordinary psychological mechanisms. Both described being escorted from their car by beings whose physical appearance matched in specific detail. Both described the interior of a craft. Both described being separated and subjected to physical examinations. Betty described a long needle being inserted into her abdomen, an experience she was told was a pregnancy test. Barney described the collection of biological samples, including what he understood to be sperm. The Hills were the first documented case of what researchers would come to call alien abduction in the modern era. They were not the last. In 1988, a commercial photographer named Kim Carlsberg was living in Pacific Palisades, California, in a home on the beach. She was, by any reasonable measure, a stable and professionally accomplished adult with no history of the kind of psychological instability that might produce elaborate false memories. One evening she observed a light over the ocean that she could not identify. She went to bed. She woke in the middle of the night in a location that was not her bed, in a state of paralysis, in the presence of beings she described as approximately 3.5 feet tall, with large heads, large dark eyes, and pale, almost white skin. What Carlsberg reported over the years of experiences that followed is not simply a story of observation or contact. It is a story of systematic biological use. She describes being used as a source of genetic material, eggs removed, fetuses implanted, and later retrieved, and on multiple occasions, she describes being shown children, small, quiet, unnervingly still children who carried something of her appearance, but were not entirely human in the way she understood human to mean. She was not describing a nightmare. She was describing a program. This is where the work of Dr. David Jacobs becomes significant. Dr. Jacobs was a professor of history at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he taught for more than 30 years. He was not, by training or by temperament, someone inclined toward uncritical acceptance of extraordinary claims. He came to the study of the abduction phenomenon as a skeptic, intending to examine it academically and explain it through conventional psychological or sociological frameworks. What he found, over 25 years of research involving more than 150 individuals who reported abduction experiences subjected to careful hypnotic regression under controlled conditions, was that the conventional frameworks did not fit. The accounts were too consistent, too specific, too cross-corroborated by people who had no connection to one another and no access to each other's testimony. In his 1992 book Secret Life, published by Simon & Schuster, and in his subsequent work The Threat, published in 1998, Dr. Jacobs outlined what the cumulative evidence of his research suggested. that the abduction phenomenon was not a psychological aberration, that it was not a cultural contagion spread through media exposure, that it appeared, based on the internal consistency of the accounts he had collected, to represent an actual external phenomenon, and that the central organizing purpose of that phenomenon, as reported by the people who experienced it, was biological. Specifically, one theory suggests that what is being described across these hundreds of independent accounts is a long-term hybridization program, a deliberate effort to combine human genetic material with something else, producing offspring that carry characteristics of both. The purpose of that program, if it exists, is not stated anywhere in the accounts. The beings involved, as reported by abductees, do not explain themselves. They proceed with the efficiency of researchers who understand their objectives and have no particular interest in whether their subjects understand them. Bud Hopkins, a New York-based artist and researcher who spent decades collecting and analyzing abduction accounts, documented more than 700 cases before his death in 2011. His 1987 book Intruders, published by Random House, brought the pattern of reproductive procedures in abduction accounts to wider public attention for the first time. What Hopkins observed, and what Dr. Jacobs subsequently confirmed through his own independent research, was that the reproductive element was not incidental to the abduction experience. It was, in the majority of cases, the central purpose of it. What remains unexplained is a phenomenon that several researchers, including Hopkins, began documenting in the 1970s and 80s. A pattern reported by women who had confirmed pregnancies, verified by medical examination, that subsequently disappeared without medical explanation. The pregnancy was there, and then it was not. These reports came from women in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia, across a span of several decades. And in a number of cases, the women reporting them had no knowledge of or connection to the abduction research community. One theory suggests that these cases represent the retrieval phase of the program that Carlsberg and others describe. The fetus implanted, developed to a specific point, and then removed before conventional medical detection would become a complicating factor. That theory may be wrong. It may be that every one of these cases has a conventional medical explanation that simply was not identified at the time. Science is not infallible, and the history of medicine contains many instances of phenomena that appeared mysterious until they were not. But the consistency of the pattern, across geography and across decades, and the degree to which it mirrors what abductees have been independently reporting since at least 1961, is something that sits quietly at the back of the mind once you have looked at it directly. Something was being taken from these people. Something biological. Something specific. And if the accounts of those who were brought back again and again are to be taken seriously at all, something was being made from what was taken. The question that no one in any official capacity has yet been willing to answer publicly is where those somethings are now. To David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins represent something real, then the abduction phenomenon does not end with the taking of biological material. It continues, it progresses through stages, and for a significant number of the people who report these experiences, there comes a moment that is, by any measure, the most disorienting of all. They are shown the children, not in photographs, not in descriptions offered by the beings who move through these accounts with their characteristic silence and purposefulness. In person, face to face, in rooms aboard craft that these individuals cannot locate on any map, in encounters they carry with them for the rest of their lives, with a weight that does not diminish with time. The children they describe are not quite human, but they are not entirely something else either. They occupy a space between categories that our language was not built to describe cleanly. Small, pale, unusually still for children, with eyes that are larger than they should be, and a quality of awareness in those eyes that people struggle to articulate, but consistently attempt to describe as ancient, as if something very old was looking out from a very young face. This is not the report of one person. It is not a story that originated with a single account and spread through a community of believers who unconsciously adopted its details. It is a pattern that emerged independently across hundreds of separate cases, collected by researchers who were themselves often skeptical of what they were hearing, documented over a period spanning more than 4 decades. Bud Hopkins spent the better part of his adult life trying to understand it. Hopkins was not a scientist by training. He was an artist. Based in New York City, whose work had been shown in serious galleries and whose reputation in the art world was entirely separate from his parallel life. As one of the most rigorous and prolific researchers the abduction phenomenon has ever produced, he came to the subject not through belief but through encounter. When individuals began approaching him after a 1975 article he wrote about his own sighting experience, and what they told him was consistent enough and strange enough that he could not set it aside. By the time he published Intruders in 1987, Hopkins had documented more than 700 cases. The book focused specifically on a woman he called Kathy Davis, from Indianapolis, Indiana, whose experiences had included not only repeated abductions over many years, but repeated encounters with children she was made to understand were biologically connected to her. Children who were brought to her during subsequent visits, held briefly in her presence, and then taken away again. What Hopkins observed across his broader case collection was that this presentation of hybrid offspring was not rare. It appeared in case after case, and the emotional response it produced in the people who experienced it was unlike anything else in their accounts. Not simply fear, which was common throughout abduction testimony, something more complicated, something closer to grief, mixed with a recognition they could not explain. These were not strangers being shown to them. That was the part that the people who reported these encounters found most difficult to convey. One theory suggests that this is a deliberate element of the program itself, that the presentation of hybrid offspring to the human individuals whose genetic material contributed to their creation serves a specific function within whatever larger process is underway. Whether that function is biological, psychological, or something else entirely, no researcher has been able to determine with confidence. Dr. Jacobs, whose work at Temple University gave him both the methodological discipline and the institutional standing to approach this material with considerable rigor, reached conclusions through his research that he himself described as deeply troubling, not because he wanted to believe them, but because the evidence his own careful methodology had produced did not leave him comfortable with any other interpretation. Across more than 150 cases, examined over 25 years, the pattern he documented was not simply that hybrid children existed within the experience of abductees. It was that these children appeared to be developing, aging, moving through stages. And in the more recent cases he examined, something had shifted. The hybrids being described were no longer infants or young children presented briefly in clinical settings. They were older. They were being integrated. They were being placed in environments that looked, to the people reporting encounters with them, like preparation for something, like practice. What remains unexplained is a cluster of cases from the 1990s and early 2000s in which abductees reported encounters not aboard craft but in ordinary terrestrial settings, apartments, public spaces, situations in which beings who were almost but not entirely human appeared to be learning how to move through human society, how to behave, how to pass. This is where a phenomenon that has come to be discussed within certain research communities as Project MILAB enters the picture, though with considerable caution warranted. MILAB, a term coined by researcher Dr. Helmut Lammer in the late 1990s, refers to accounts in which abductees report not only non-human contact, but what appears to be human military involvement in their experiences. Individuals in military dress, conventional vehicles, terrestrial medical facilities being used in conjunction with non-terrestrial ones. The suggestion embedded in these accounts is that at least some human institutional apparatus is aware of what is happening and has been, for some period of time, involved with it in ways that have never been publicly acknowledged. Archaeologists have noted, as an analogy, that the most significant discoveries in human history have rarely been announced at the moment of their occurrence. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, and their full contents were not made available to the broader scholarly community for decades. The mechanisms by which knowledge is controlled, delayed, and selectively released are not hypothetical. They are historically documented. One theory suggests that the military involvement reported in MILAB cases represents an awareness within certain governmental structures that the hybridization program is real, is ongoing, and produces results that have strategic implications. What those implications might be, and what response, if any, has been formulated, remains entirely outside the public record. Mary Rodwell is a clinical hypnotherapist and researcher based in Australia, and the founder of the Australian Close Encounter Resource Network, known as ACERN. Over more than 2 decades of practice, Rodwell has worked with more than 3,000 individuals who report contact experiences, a significant portion of whom are children or the parents of children, displaying what she describes as anomalous characteristics, unusually advanced cognitive abilities, apparent knowledge of subjects they have not been taught, a sense of otherness that their parents struggle to describe but consistently report, and in a number of cases, explicit memories of environments and beings that do not correspond to anything in their ordinary experience. What remains unexplained is why this population of children appears to be growing. Rodwell is not the only researcher noting the pattern. Similar observations have been made by therapists and educators working independently in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in several European countries. Children who do not fit, children who seem, by the accounts of those closest to them, to be oriented towards something that their current environment cannot quite accommodate. One theory suggests these children are not anomalies at all, that they represent exactly what the pattern documented by Hopkins and Jacobs and Carlsberg and so many others across so many decades would predict. The next stage, the integration that the older abduction accounts seem to be building toward, beings who carry enough of the human template to move through human society without immediate detection, but who carry something else as well. Something older. Something that did not originate on this planet. That theory may be wrong. The children Rodwell and others describe may have explanations that fall entirely within the range of conventional developmental psychology and cognitive science. The human mind is vast and variable, and what looks like otherness from the outside is not always what it appears. But the pattern has been there for decades now, quietly accumulating, case by case, country by country, researcher by researcher, and the children, whatever they are growing up. An uncomfortable position in the landscape of scientific inquiry. Not evidence that has been fabricated or that falls apart under examination. Evidence that has been examined, carefully and repeatedly, by credentialed researchers using established methodology, and that has produced results that do not fit the framework those researchers were applying when they began. This evidence does not disappear when it is inconvenient. It does not resolve itself into a comfortable explanation simply because a comfortable explanation is preferred. It sits there, in the published record, in the laboratory reports, in the measured and photographed and catalogued physical reality of objects that should not exist in the form they take, waiting for a framework adequate to contain it. We return, briefly, to Pacific Palisades, California, to the coroner's office where the body of Jeffrey Allen Lash was examined in the summer of 2015. The anomaly that investigators noted was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are usually presented. It was quiet, almost bureaucratic, a finding in a report. The man had no fingerprints, not degraded fingerprints, not the kind of partial ridge detail that decomposition sometimes leaves behind. No fingerprints. In a body that had not decomposed to the point where their absence would be expected by any forensic standard the coroner's office applied. Fingerprints are among the most durable features of the human body. They form in the womb, between the 13th and 19th week of fetal development, and they remain essentially unchanged from that point until decomposition in death reaches a stage significantly more advanced than what was observed in Lash's case. Their complete absence is not a common finding. It is not something that has a long list of conventional explanations, and in the context of everything else surrounding Jeffrey Allen Lash, it is the kind of detail that a careful mind returns to without quite being able to set it down. But Lash is a single case, a single data point. And single data points, however strange, do not by themselves constitute a pattern. What constitutes a pattern is what has been emerging slowly and with increasing scientific attention from the desert plateaus of southern Peru. In 1928, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio C. Tello led an excavation on the Paracas Peninsula, a harsh and largely uninhabited stretch of coastline in the Ica region of southern Peru. Tello was not a fringe figure. He is considered the father of Peruvian archaeology, a man whose contributions to the understanding of pre-Columbian civilization in South America were foundational and are still recognized as such by mainstream academic institutions. What he uncovered on the Paracas Peninsula was a burial site containing more than 300 mummified individuals, many of whom possessed skulls of a size and shape that immediately distinguished them from the surrounding population. The Paracas skulls, as they came to be known, are elongated to a degree that is immediately visible and measurable. The cranial volume of many of these skulls is significantly larger than the average human cranial volume, in some cases by 50% or more. The standard explanation offered for elongated skulls found in archaeological contexts is a practice known as cranial binding, in which the heads of infants are bound with cloth or boards over a period of years to produce an artificially elongated shape. This practice was documented in several ancient cultures and is well established in the archaeological record. The problem with applying that explanation to the Paracas skulls is anatomical. Archaeologists have noted that cranial binding, regardless of the duration or method applied, cannot increase the volume of the cranium. It can redistribute the existing bone into a more elongated profile, but the total internal volume remains essentially unchanged, because binding applied externally does not cause the brain, and therefore the skull that houses it, to grow larger. It only causes the existing material to be redistributed. The Paracas skulls do not show redistribution. They show additional volume. In some specimens, the parietal plate, the section of bone at the top and back of the skull, is a single fused plate rather than the two separate plates joined by a suture that appear in every normal human skull. This is not a feature that binding produces. It is a feature that suggests a different underlying bone structure. Beginning around 2012, a researcher named Brian Forster, working in conjunction with the Paracas History Project, undertook an effort to have DNA extracted from several of the Paracas skull specimens and analyzed at licensed laboratories. The results, published informally through the project rather than through peer-reviewed journals, which has been a legitimate point of criticism from mainstream researchers, indicated haplogroup patterns that did not correspond cleanly to any known indigenous population of the Americas, nor to any population of Asia, Europe, or Africa that would fit conventional migration models for the peopling of the American continent. One theory suggests that the Paracas individuals represented a genetically distinct population that arrived in South America through means and from origins that the current archaeological consensus has not accounted for. What remains unexplained is why the mitochondrial DNA extracted from these specimens appears, in the analysis conducted, to carry mutations that the researchers involved described as never before seen in any human genetic database they had access to. The mainstream scientific community has responded to the Paracas DNA findings with appropriate caution. The samples were not processed under conditions that meet the rigorous contamination prevention standards required for ancient DNA research at institutions like the Max Planck Institute. The chain of custody for the specimens has been questioned, and the absence of peer review means the findings have not been subjected to the scrutiny that science requires before conclusions can be drawn. These are legitimate concerns, and they matter. But the physical anomalies in the skulls themselves, the volume, the fused parietal plate, the bone density differences, these are not dependent on the DNA results. They are measurable, they are documented, and they have not received a fully satisfying conventional explanation. The Paracas skulls are not alone in presenting this problem. In the early 1930s, in a rural area of the state of Chihuahua in northern Mexico, a young girl reportedly discovered two skeletons buried in the dirt. One was conventionally human in its proportions, the other was not. The skull of the second skeleton was significantly larger than normal, flattened at the back in a way that did not correspond to cranial binding, and unusually light in weight despite being structurally sound. This specimen eventually came into the possession of a researcher named Lloyd Pye, who spent more than a decade from 1999 onward attempting to have it scientifically analyzed. The skull came to be known as the Star Child skull. In 2003, a laboratory called Trace Genetics in Sacramento, California, extracted DNA from the Star Child skull and analyzed what they recovered. The mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the maternal line, was human, but the nuclear DNA, which carries the genetic contribution of both parents, produced results that the laboratory found difficult to interpret cleanly within a fully human framework. The analysis suggested the possibility of a paternal genetic contribution that differed substantially from the human baseline. One theory suggests that the star-child skull represents exactly what the abduction researchers have been describing from the experiential side: a physical, recoverable, scientifically testable remnant of a hybrid individual, a being who carried human genetics on one side of its ancestry and something else on the other. That theory has not been proven. The DNA analysis of the star-child skull has not been replicated under conditions that would satisfy the peer review standards of mainstream genetics, and Lloyd Pye's advocacy for the specimen made it difficult for the scientific community to engage with it on purely technical terms. These are real limitations. What remains unexplained is the physical structure of the skull itself. The bone is thinner than normal human skull bone, yet significantly stronger. The interior surface shows none of the impressions left by the meningeal arteries that run along the inside of every normal human skull. The depth of the eye sockets is shallower than human norms in a way that suggests the eyes themselves were differently configured. These are structural features that do not disappear because the DNA analysis is contested. Archaeologists have noted that the history of physical anthropology contains many instances of specimens that were explained away before adequate tools existed to examine them properly. The Denisovans were unknown to science until 2010, identified from a fragment of bone so small it could rest on a fingertip, by DNA technology that did not exist a generation earlier. The tools for understanding what the Paracas skulls and the star-child skull represent may not yet fully exist, or they may exist, and the results they produce may be sitting in laboratory reports that have not found their way into the public record. What we can say, with the evidence currently available, is this: the physical world has left behind objects that do not fit the story we currently tell about human biological history. They are real objects. They have been measured and photographed, and in several cases, subjected to DNA analysis. And they sit, undisturbed, at the edge of what our framework can accommodate, waiting for a framework large enough to hold them. The ancient world did not only leave us words carved into clay and stone, it left us bones, and some of those bones are asking questions that the words alone could never ask with the same quiet, undeniable weight. Ancient texts or recovered skulls, or the testimony of individuals who woke in the middle of the night in places they did not recognize. There is a version of this story that lives entirely within the official record, within documents produced by governments, signed by generals and intelligence directors, filed in archives, and in many cases, released to the public through mechanisms that exist precisely because democratic societies decided, at some point, that citizens had a right to know what was being done in their name. That version of the story is, in some ways, more unsettling than any of the others, because it cannot be set aside as myth or misperception or the product of an overactive imagination. It is paperwork. It is bureaucracy. It is the slow, careful language of institutions recording what they found and, in many cases, recording that they did not know what to make of what they found. We begin in 1952. The United States Air Force, responding to a surge in reported sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena that had been building since the late 1940s, formally established a program called Project Blue Book, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. The stated purpose of the program was straightforward: to determine whether unidentified flying objects posed a threat to national security and to scientifically analyze the data being reported by pilots, military personnel, and civilians across the country. Project Blue Book ran from 1952 until 1969, when it was officially closed following a review commissioned from the University of Colorado and led by physicist Edward Condon. During its operational period, the program investigated 12,618 reported sightings. Of those, the Air Force concluded that the vast majority had conventional explanations: weather phenomena, aircraft misidentified in unusual atmospheric conditions, astronomical objects observed at unfamiliar angles. But 701 cases were classified differently. 701 cases, after full investigation by a program with access to the resources of the United States Air Force, were designated as unidentified, not misidentified, not explained by conventional means. That designation has never been changed. Those files remain available through the National Archives, and the unidentified classification attached to 701 of them remains exactly as it was when Project Blue Book closed its doors in December of 1969. What remains unexplained is why, if the phenomena being investigated were simply misperceptions and atmospheric anomalies, the program was closed rather than expanded, at precisely the moment public interest in the subject was reaching levels that might have warranted more investigation, not less. One theory suggests that Project Blue Book served a dual purpose. That alongside its stated function as a scientific inquiry, it operated as a public relations mechanism designed to provide a credible institutional response to public concern, while the more sensitive aspects of the government's engagement with the phenomenon were managed through channels that left no paper trail accessible to civilian oversight. That theory cannot be confirmed from the public record. But the public record does contain enough to make it something other than simple speculation. In 1984, a television producer named Jaime Shandera received an unsolicited package in the mail at his home in Los Angeles, California. When developed, the film contained photographs of what appeared to be a classified government briefing document dated November 18, 1952, addressed to President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower. The document described a secret committee of 12 senior military figures, intelligence officials, and scientists, referred to within the document as Majestic 12, or MJ-12, established by order of President Harry S. Truman on September 24, 1947, in direct response to the recovery of a crashed craft of non-terrestrial origin near Roswell, New Mexico, earlier that year. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a file on the Majestic 12 documents. That file exists. It is accessible through the FBI's Public Records Vault at vault.fbi.gov, where it has been available for download for years. The FBI's investigation concluded that the documents were, in the Bureau's official language, bogus, meaning the FBI believed them to be fabrications. That conclusion has been accepted by many researchers and rejected by others, and the debate over the authenticity of the Majestic 12 documents has continued without resolution for 4 decades. What is not in dispute is that the FBI investigated them seriously enough to open a formal file. And what remains unexplained is the origin of the documents themselves. No source was ever identified. No forger was ever named. No individual or organization ever came forward to claim responsibility for producing them. They arrived. They were investigated. And their origin remained, and remains, unknown. Archaeologists have noted, as an analogy, that the provenance of a document matters as much as its content in determining its historical value. A document of uncertain origin is not automatically false. It is uncertain, and uncertainty, in the official record, is a category that deserves its own careful attention. In 2002, a document surfaced within the UFO research community that has come to be known as the Wilson-Davis Memo. It purports to record a conversation that took place in the offices of a Washington, D.C. think tank called the Earth Tech International Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, Texas, between Rear Admiral Thomas Ray Wilson, who served as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1999 to 2002. Eric Davis, a physicist with a legitimate and documented professional record in aerospace research. The document, if authentic, records Wilson describing his attempt to gain access to a classified government program involving the recovery and reverse engineering of non-human technology, and his being denied that access by private defense contractors operating under security classifications that excluded even his level of clearance as a senior intelligence official. The Wilson-Davis Memo was published by the Black Vault, a civilian organization that has spent more than 2 decades filing Freedom of Information Act requests and compiling declassified government documents related to unidentified aerial phenomena. Dr. Eric Davis has neither fully confirmed nor fully denied the document's authenticity in any public statement that settles the matter conclusively. Admiral Wilson has denied it. The document itself has been analyzed by multiple researchers for signs of fabrication and has not been definitively discredited on technical grounds. One theory suggests that what the Wilson-Davis Memo describes, if accurate, is among the most significant things ever committed to paper on this subject. Not simply that non-human technology exists in government custody, but that the knowledge of its existence has been so thoroughly compartmentalized that even the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency could not access it. That the information sits not within the government itself, but within private defense contractors operating under security frameworks that exist outside normal congressional oversight. That theory intersects with something that is not a theory at all. It is legislation, passed by the United States Congress, signed into law. In December of 2023, the UAP Disclosure Act was incorporated into the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024. The legislation, championed in the Senate by Senator Chuck Schumer of New York and Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, called for the mandatory declassification and public release of government records related to unidentified aerial phenomena and established a review board to oversee that process. The language of the bill, as passed and signed, explicitly acknowledged the possibility that the government possessed records related to non-human intelligence and non-human technology that had not been disclosed to the public or to Congress. This is not a fringe document. It is a law of the United States, and the fact that Congress found it necessary to pass legislation specifically requiring the disclosure of records in this area implies, at minimum, that those doing the legislating had reason to believe such records existed and were being withheld. What remains unexplained is the gap between what the legislation demanded and what has subsequently been released. The review process, established by the UAP Disclosure Act, has moved slowly, and the volume of material declassified in response to its provisions has fallen considerably short of what its sponsors indicated they expected to receive. Whether that gap reflects bureaucratic resistance, legitimate national security concerns, or something else entirely is not yet clear from the public record. Archaeologists have noted that the most revealing documents in any historical archive are rarely the ones that confirm what happened. They are the ones that reveal the shape of what is missing, the redactions, the gaps in the filing sequence, the files that are referenced in other documents but cannot themselves be located. In the official records surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena and the possibility of non-human biological entities interacting with the human population, the shape of what is missing is very large indeed. 701 unidentified cases from Project Blue Book. A memo describing a senior intelligence official being denied access to programs within his own government, and a law passed by the United States Congress that acknowledges, in its own careful bureaucratic language, that humanity may not have been alone in its own history. The files do not tell us everything. They may not tell us the most important things, but they tell us enough to know that the question being asked in these ancient and faded documents, and in these laboratories, and in the quiet testimony of people who woke in the wrong place in the middle of the night, is not a question that the official world has been entirely willing to leave unanswered. It has been trying to answer it, carefully, quietly, in language designed to reveal as little as possible, while still putting something on the record. And what it has put on the record, even in that careful and guarded language, is more than most people realize. Grasslands across nearly every continent on Earth that has been quietly dismantling one of the most foundational assumptions of conventional biology for decades. It does not do this through any deliberate effort. It does this simply by existing, by functioning, by doing, several hundred times per second, something that the stepwise logic of Darwinian evolution has never been able to fully account for. It is called the bombardier beetle, and once you understand what happens inside its body, the question it raises does not go away easily. The bombardier beetle belongs to the tribe Brachynenae, a grouping within the family Carabidae that has been studied by entomologists for well over a century. It is not a large creature. It is not visually dramatic in the way that the creatures of nature documentaries tend to be. It is small and brown and easy to overlook, but when it is threatened, something takes place inside its abdomen that has no parallel in the natural world and no straightforward explanation in the language of gradual biological change. The beetle manufactures and deploys a chemical weapon. Inside its abdomen are two separate chambers, each producing a different chemical compound. The first chamber produces hydroquinones. The second produces hydrogen peroxide. These two substances are kept entirely separate during production, because combining them prematurely would be catastrophic for the organism producing them. When the beetle is threatened, both compounds are forced simultaneously into a third chamber, a reaction vessel lined with enzymes that act as a catalyst. The resulting chemical reaction is explosive in the most literal sense. It produces a temperature at the point of reaction of approximately 100 degrees Celsius, which is the boiling point of water at sea level. The superheated mixture is then expelled through a rotatable nozzle at the tip of the beetle's abdomen, directed with precision toward whatever is threatening it at a rate of approximately 500 pulses per second. The spray can cause chemical burns on human skin. It is lethal to many of the small predators the beetle regularly encounters, and the mechanism that delivers it, the rotatable nozzle, can aim in almost any direction, including forward, which requires the beetle to bend its abdomen in a way that looks, in slow-motion footage, almost deliberate, almost considered, like something that was designed with a specific threat environment in mind. Dr. Phil Ward, an entomologist at the University of California, Davis, has studied the ant subfamily Formicidae for decades and has engaged with the broader question of evolutionary complexity in insect biology throughout his career. The bombardier beetle represents one of the genuinely difficult cases in the literature on what biologists call irreducible complexity, a concept introduced by biochemist Michael Behe of Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in his 1996 book, Darwin's Black Box. The argument, stated simply, is that certain biological systems are composed of multiple interdependent parts, each of which is necessary for the system to function at all, such that the removal of any single part causes the entire system to collapse into uselessness. The bombardier beetle's chemical defense system is one of the most frequently cited examples of this argument. Each component of the system, the hydroquinone chamber, the hydrogen peroxide chamber, the reaction vessel, the catalytic enzymes, the rotatable nozzle, the neural mechanism that coordinates the simultaneous release of both compounds at the precise moment required, is necessary for the system to function. A beetle with the hydroquinone chamber but not the hydrogen peroxide chamber has no defense. A beetle with both chambers but without the catalytic enzymes has two chambers of chemicals that will never react. A beetle with all of the chemistry but without the rotatable nozzle has a weapon it cannot aim. And a beetle experimenting with any intermediate stage of this system, through the random mutations and selective pressures that conventional evolutionary theory relies upon, would be, in the most immediate practical sense, blowing itself apart. One theory suggests that the bombardier beetle's defense system could not have developed through gradual stepwise evolution, and that its existence implies a different kind of origin. Not necessarily a supernatural one, but one that involves a level of design intelligence operating at a scale and with a precision that the random processes of natural selection, operating over even vast periods of time, cannot straightforwardly account for. Mainstream biology has responses to this argument. Evolutionary biologists have proposed pathways through which each component of the bombardier beetle's system might have developed independently, serving different functions before being co-opted into the integrated system that exists today. These proposals are scientifically serious and deserve to be taken as such. What remains unexplained is why, across more than a century of intensive study of this organism, no intermediate form has ever been identified in the fossil record or in living populations that would demonstrate one of those proposed pathways in physical, observable reality. The bombardier beetle is not the only organism that presents this kind of difficulty. The tardigrade, a microscopic animal found in environments ranging from the deep ocean floor to the upper layers of the atmosphere, has been the subject of intensive research at institutions including the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, known as JAXA, which conducted studies on tardigrade survival in the conditions of outer space in 2008. What those studies confirmed was that tardigrades can survive exposure to the vacuum of space, to levels of radiation that would be lethal to any other known organism, to temperatures approaching absolute zero, and to pressures far beyond anything they would encounter in any terrestrial environment. They do this by entering a state called cryptobiosis, in which their metabolic processes reduce to an almost undetectable level, and their cells are protected by a protein unique to their species, a protein that has no known analogue in any other form of life on Earth. One theory suggests that the tardigrade's suite of survival capabilities is so far beyond anything required by its terrestrial environment that it implies an origin point outside that environment, that it was built at some level of biological organization, for conditions that exist not on this planet, but between planets. In the silence of interstellar space, the axolotl, a salamander native to the lake complex near Mexico City and the subject of ongoing research at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, possesses the ability to regenerate not just skin and simple tissue, but entire limbs, portions of its heart, sections of its spinal cord, and parts of its brain, with a completeness and precision that has no parallel in any vertebrate species closely related to it on the evolutionary tree. Research into the mechanisms underlying axolotl regeneration has been ongoing for more than a century and has produced detailed understanding of the molecular processes involved without producing a satisfying answer to the larger question of why this particular organism possesses a capability so far beyond what its evolutionary relatives developed. Archaeologists have noted that anomalous specimens, organisms or objects that fall outside the expected range of their category, have historically served as the most productive sites of scientific discovery. The platypus, when first described to European scientists in 1799, was so far outside existing biological categories that the initial specimens sent to England were believed to be fabrications. The scientific framework of the time could not accommodate what the physical evidence was presenting. One theory suggests that the bombardier beetle, the tardigrade, and the axolotl are not anomalies in the sense of being mistakes or outliers. They are anomalies in the sense of being messages, organisms placed within the biological record of this planet, or whose genetic material was introduced into this planet's biology, not through the slow accumulation of random mutations, but through a process of deliberate engineering by an intelligence with both the knowledge and the intention to produce specific results. If that intelligence exists, or existed, because there is one organism on this planet whose biological complexity, whose sudden genetic acceleration, whose appearance in the fossil record with a speed and completeness that has troubled paleontologists for generations, presents the same category of difficulty as the bombardier beetle. The same gap between what gradual processes can account for and what the physical evidence actually shows. That organism is us. And if something engineered the beetle and left no signature we can read in the conventional record, the possibility that the same hand touched our genome and left its mark in 7% of what we carry in every cell of our bodies is not a question that the evidence allows us to dismiss as easily as we might like. Something built these things. Something that understood biology at a level we are only beginning to approach. And it did not leave a name. It left the work itself, silent, ancient, and undisturbed, waiting in the bodies of creatures that have been walking this earth long before anyone thought to ask why they are so impossible, where the historical evidence, the ancient texts, and the buried skulls, and the laboratory reports, and the declassified files gives way to something more immediate, something that is not centuries old or even decades old, something that is happening now, or that was happening recently enough that the people involved are still alive, still speaking, still carrying what they experienced into a present that has not yet decided what to do with them. We have spent considerable time in the deep past, in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia and the caves of Qumran and the burial grounds of the Paracas Peninsula. We have spent time in the middle distance, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, with Betty and Barney Hill and Kim Carlsberg and the researchers who spent their careers trying to make sense of what those individuals and hundreds of others were reporting. But the pattern does not stop there. It does not belong only to history. And the modern chapter of this story contains some of its most difficult and most carefully documented material. We return, one final time, to Jeffrey Allen Lash, because the strangeness of his case does not begin or end with the arsenal found in his home or the absence of fingerprints noted by the coroner. It extends into the background that investigators and researchers attempted to construct after his death, and into the near total opacity of that background. A man of 60 years leaves traces: employment records, tax filings, medical history, educational credentials, the ordinary paper residue of an ordinary life in a modern bureaucratic society. Lash's background, when examined, produced traces that did not connect into a coherent picture. Researchers within the community that studies contact between humans and non-human intelligences noted something additional. The suggestion, which has never been confirmed but has never been definitively dismissed, that Lash's father may have been among the scientists brought to examine materials recovered from the crash site near Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947. If that connection existed, then Jeffrey Allen Lash was not simply a strange man with unexplained weapons and an unusual personal narrative. He was potentially the second generation of something, a line of involvement stretching from the most famous alleged retrieval event in the history of this subject, directly into a residential street in Pacific Palisades in the summer of 2015. That connection is unverified. It may be wrong, but it is the kind of detail that, once noted, changes the texture of everything surrounding it. On May 9th, 2001, in a press conference held at the National Press Club in Washington, District of Columbia, an event took place that has received considerably less mainstream attention than its content would seem to warrant. The Disclosure Project, organized by Dr. Stephen Greer, a former emergency medicine physician, brought together more than 20 individuals with military, intelligence, and government backgrounds to testify publicly about their direct professional encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena and, in several cases, with non-human biological entities. Among those who testified was Sergeant Clifford Stone, a retired United States Army veteran who served for 22 years and who stated, under his own name and on the public record, that during his military career he had been involved in the retrieval of craft and occupants of non-human origin. He stated that the United States government had catalogued, by the time of his service, 57 distinct species or varieties of non-human intelligent beings. He described the existence of an ET retrieval team within the military structure, a specialized unit whose function was exactly what the name implies. Sergeant Stone was not an anonymous source. He was not speaking through an intermediary or under a pseudonym. He gave his name, his service record, and his testimony in front of cameras at a venue that is among the most recognized in American journalism, with reporters present. His account has never been officially rebutted by the Department of Defense or any other government body. It has been ignored, which is a different thing. One theory suggests that the 57 species Stone described are not all visitors, that some of them, the ones whose biological profile most closely resembles our own, are something more complicated than visitors, that they represent the cumulative result of the program that the abduction researchers documented from the experiential side, beings who are the product of generations of hybridization, now sufficiently human in their presentation to move through human society without the kind of immediate, obvious detection that a being of entirely non-human appearance would provoke. This is where the work of Mary Rodwell acquires a particular weight. Rodwell is a clinical hypnotherapist and the founder of the Australian Close Encounter Resource Network, based in Perth, Western Australia. She has been working with individuals who report contact experiences since the early 1990s, and over more than 2 decades, she has engaged professionally with more than 3,000 such individuals. Her clinical background means she approaches these accounts with the framework of a practitioner trained to assess psychological state, to distinguish between the presentations of different kinds of psychological distress, and to recognize when a client's account does not fit the patterns associated with confabulation, fantasy, or psychotic experience. What Rodwell has documented, and what she has presented at conferences, including those organized by the International Congress of Clinical Hypnosis and at various academic institutions, is a population of children that she refers to in her published work as the new humans. These are children brought to her, or to colleagues whose cases she has subsequently reviewed, by parents who are struggling to understand something about their child that falls outside any framework the parents have been given. The characteristics these children present are consistent across cases that have no connection to one another. An unusual relationship with technology, including the ability to interact with electronic systems in ways that are difficult to explain through ordinary learning. Knowledge of subjects, including advanced mathematics, astronomy, and in some cases, specific details of physics, that the children have demonstrably not been taught. A sense of mission that the children themselves articulate with a directness and specificity that their parents find difficult to dismiss as ordinary childhood imagination. And in a significant number of cases, explicit memories of environments and beings that do not correspond to anything in terrestrial experience. Rodwell's interpretation of these cases, presented carefully and with the qualifications appropriate to a clinical practitioner rather than an ideological advocate, is that these children represent something genuinely new in the human population, not a metaphor for exceptional intelligence or unusual creativity, both of which have conventional explanations, but a literal biological novelty. Individuals who carry something in their genetic and cognitive makeup that was not present in their parents or in the broader population from which their parents came. Archaeologists have noted that every significant transition in the human story has been invisible to the people living through it. The individuals whose descendants would become the first agriculturalists did not know they were standing at the threshold of the Neolithic Revolution. The members of the first communities to develop writing did not understand that they were inaugurating the age of recorded history. Transitions of this kind are only visible in retrospect, when enough time has passed that the before and the after can be held in the same frame. One theory suggests that what Rodwell is documenting, and what the broader pattern of modern contact reports points toward, is exactly this kind of transition. Occurring now, occurring gradually enough that it can be dismissed case by case, child by child, report by report, but accumulating into something that will eventually be impossible to dismiss in aggregate. What remains unexplained is the geographic distribution of the cases Rodwell and her colleagues have collected. They do not cluster in any particular region. They do not correlate with any known environmental or demographic factor. They appear in rural communities and in cities, in families with no prior history of contact experiences, and in families with multi-generational patterns of unusual encounters. They appear in Australia and in the United States and in the United Kingdom and in Brazil and in Japan and in South Africa. They appear, in other words, everywhere. Quietly, without announcement. Without the kind of dramatic, undeniable event that would force the question into spaces where it could no longer be managed with silence. And that, perhaps, is the most ancient and consistent feature of this entire story. From the Anunnaki texts of Sumer to the burial grounds of the Paracas Peninsula, to the testimony of Clifford Stone at the National Press Club, to the children sitting in Mary Rodwell's clinical office in Perth, Western Australia, describing memories of places they have never been, in bodies that are almost, but not entirely, like everyone around them. The defining characteristic of what is happening has always been the same. It does not announce itself. It simply continues. Beneath the surface of the ordinary world, in the forgotten spaces between what we know and what we have not yet allowed ourselves to consider, something has been unfolding across centuries. Patient, purposeful, and if the pattern holds, closer to its conclusion than any point in the long, silent history of its unfolding. The question that remains, the one that every thread of this investigation converges upon without quite reaching, is what that conclusion looks like, and whether, when it arrives, we will recognize it for what it is through this investigation. From the genetic laboratories of Leipzig and Madison to the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, from the White Mountains of New Hampshire to the desert plateaus of southern Peru, from the coroner's report on a man with no fingerprints in Pacific Palisades to the testimony of a retired army sergeant at the National Press Club in Washington, from the impossible chemistry of a small beetle in the forests of 4 continents to the clinical files of a hypnotherapist in Perth, Western Australia, documenting children who remember places they have never been. Each of these threads, examined individually, can be set aside. Any single piece of this can be explained, or at least contained, within a framework that does not require us to fundamentally revise our understanding of what we are and where we came from. The DNA acceleration has conventional evolutionary explanations that serious scientists continue to refine. The abduction accounts can be attributed to sleep paralysis, to false memory syndrome, to the documented human tendency to construct narrative from ambiguous sensory experience. The skulls of Paracas can be revisited with better contamination protocols and cleaner chains of custody. The declassified documents can be read as the ordinary confusion and institutional overreach of a Cold War security apparatus that classified everything as a matter of reflexive habit. Each thread, individually, can be managed. But we are not looking at the threads individually anymore. We are looking at the pattern they form when held together. And the pattern is not something that any single conventional explanation can account for, because it spans disciplines and centuries and continents and forms of evidence so different from one another that no single mechanism of misperception or fabrication could have produced all of them. Something is there. The question that the evidence forces, the one that sits at the center of everything we have examined, is not whether something is there, it is what that something is, and what it wants. There are 3 serious positions on this question, and each of them deserves to be held with the same careful attention. The first position is the one held by the majority of working scientists who have engaged with this material at all. It holds that the convergence of evidence we have examined is not a convergence at all, but an artifact of the human mind's extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition, a capacity so powerful that it finds patterns even in noise, even in the random and the coincidental, even in the gaps between things that have no actual connection to one another. The DNA acceleration is real, but explainable through population dynamics and the selective pressures of the agricultural revolution. The abduction accounts are real experiences produced by real neurological events, by the documented malleability of human memory under conditions of stress and hypnotic suggestion. The ancient texts describing sky beings and hybrid offspring are mythology in the precise academic sense, meaning they are cultural products that encode the values and anxieties and explanatory frameworks of the societies that produced them, not historical records of literal events. Under this position, the question we have been asking throughout this investigation is not forbidden. It is simply answered, and the answer is that we are alone, that we have always been alone, and that the long human dream of something out there that made us what we are is exactly that. Ancient, persistent, and entirely our own. This position is serious. It is held by serious people, and the possibility that it is correct should not be dismissed simply because it is unsatisfying. The second position accepts that something real is happening, but locates its origin within the human story rather than outside it. It holds that the beings described in abduction accounts and ancient texts represent a branch of the human family that diverged at some point in the deep past, developing along a separate technological and biological trajectory that has remained hidden from mainstream historical awareness. Under this position, the Anunnaki were not extraterrestrials in the sense of beings from another solar system. They were terrestrial intelligences, perhaps the remnants of a civilization that predates the ones we know, that achieved a level of biological and technological sophistication we have not yet recovered or fully understood, and that has been interacting with the broader human population, selectively and carefully, across the entire span of recorded history. One theory suggests that what abductees are encountering, and what the hybrid children represent, is not an intervention from outside this world, but a reunion between branches of the human family that were separated long ago, now in the process of being reintegrated through means that look, from the outside, like something far more alien than they actually are. The third position is the one that the evidence most visibly points toward, and the one that the official record has come closest to acknowledging in its most candid moments. It holds that the intervention is real, that it is external in origin, and that it has been ongoing across a period of time so vast that the distinction between what we call human history and what we call prehistory may not be the meaningful boundary we have assumed it to be. Under this position, the 7% change in human DNA is not a mystery to be solved by better population genetics. It is a signature. The ancient texts are not mythology, they are archives. The abduction accounts are not the product of neurological anomaly. They are reports from the front of a program that has been running, with patience and with purpose, since before the first city rose from the plains of Mesopotamia. And the hybrid children documented by Mary Rodwell and her colleagues in Perth and London and Sao Paulo and Tokyo are not anomalies in the developmental record. They are the latest iteration of something that has been building across centuries toward a moment that the program has always been oriented toward, without ever announcing what that moment would look like or when it would arrive. What remains unexplained, under any of these 3 positions, is the question of intention. Even if the intervention is real, even if the program is exactly what the pattern suggests it to be, the purpose behind it remains the most deeply buried question of all. The beings described in every account we have examined, from the Anunnaki of the Sumerian tablets to the grey figures of the modern abduction literature, do not explain themselves. They do not offer rationale. They proceed with the focused efficiency of researchers who understand their objectives completely and have no particular investment in whether the subjects of their research understand those objectives at all. There are those who read this as benevolent, who see in the long arc of the hybridization program, if it exists, an effort to preserve something essential about the human line through whatever is coming, a biological insurance policy written in the only medium that survives everything, DNA itself. Under this reading, the hybrid children are not a replacement for humanity. They are an extension of it, carrying forward what matters most about what we are, in a form capable of surviving what we may not. There are those who read it as something colder, who see in the absence of consent and the absence of explanation, not the detachment of scientists, but the indifference of something that regards us the way we regard the subjects of our own research. With interest, perhaps, with a measure of care for the integrity of the process, but without the quality of regard that would make our understanding of that process a priority. And there are those who hold both possibilities simultaneously, who have sat with this material long enough to understand that the question of intention may be the one question that the evidence, however carefully examined, cannot answer, because intention requires communication, and whatever is out there, if it is out there, has never spoken in a language we have been able to fully read. We may be approaching the moment when that changes. The UAP Disclosure Act, the congressional hearings, the retired intelligence officials speaking on the record about things they were told for decades to keep silent about. Something is shifting in the space between what is known and what is acknowledged, slowly, which is, of course, exactly how this story has always moved, not with the sudden arrival of something undeniable, but with the quiet accumulation of things that were always there, waiting beneath the surface of the world we thought we understood. For the moment when enough of us were finally willing to look, we have covered a great deal of ground tonight, from a coroner's report in a quiet neighborhood in California to the oldest written records our civilization has ever produced, from the genetic laboratories of Leipzig and Madison to the burial grounds of the Paracas Peninsula, from the testimony of people who woke in the wrong place in the middle of the night to the declassified files of governments that spent decades insisting there was nothing to see. And now, as this particular journey comes to a close, I want you to set all of it down for a moment, not to forget it, but to let it settle, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly finding its resting place in the silence beneath the surface. Because the questions we have been sitting with tonight are not the kind that resolve themselves in a single sitting. They are the kind that stay with you, that surface quietly in the hours between waking and sleep, when the noise of the ordinary day has finally gone still and the mind is left alone with what it has been carrying. Somewhere out there tonight, under the same stars that the people of ancient Sumer looked up at when they pressed their accounts of the Anunnaki into wet clay, someone is lying awake with the same question you are carrying right now. They may be in a city you have never visited, in a language you have never spoken, on a continent, an ocean away from wherever you are at this moment. Are we alone in our own origin? And if we are not, what does that mean for everything we thought we knew about ourselves? Let that question breathe tonight. Let it rest alongside you in the quiet. If this is your first time here at the Mr. H Chronicles, I hope this gave you something worth thinking about. If you would like to continue following these threads wherever they lead, subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. And if something in tonight's journey stayed with you, I would genuinely love to know which part. For those who have been here from the beginning, as always, thank you. Truly, this is Mr. H. Rest well and sleep on this.